The 2000s Premier League did not announce itself as the greatest era in football history the moment the calendar turned. It slowly and brutally earned that title through chaos, rivalry, blood, sweat, controversy, and unforgettable characters until the league became something more than football and transformed into a weekly global spectacle that felt raw, dangerous, emotional, and real. An era born at the crossroads of old football and modern football, where tradition collided violently with money, television, power, and personality, creating a decade that still feels unmatched even today because it existed in a perfect storm that can never be recreated again. The stadiums were close to the pitch, the tackles were heavy, the referees were feared less than the players, and every weekend felt like survival rather than entertainment. This was a league where reputations were built on fear, where forwards knew that every run could end in pain, and defenders accepted punishment as part of their identity. And yet within that brutality, there was an artistry that flourished because skill had to be earned, not protected. Players like Thierry Henry did not glide because the game allowed it, they glided because they were brave enough to do so in a world designed to stop them. The Premier League at the turn of the millennium was still carrying the scars of its working-class roots, even as television money began to flood in, meaning the culture of the game remained aggressive, uncompromising, and deeply emotional, while the talent pool expanded beyond anything England had ever seen. This combination produced a league where physical dominance, tactical evolution, and individual brilliance were forced to coexist. Manchester United stood as the empire of the era, a machine built by Sir Alex Ferguson, whose influence shaped not just his club, but the entire league, because every other team defined itself by how it tried to stop United, whether through physical intimidation, relentless pressing, or counter-attacking ambition. And United were not just winners, they were psychological warfare experts who believed games could be won in tunnels, dressing rooms, and final minutes. The fear of conceding late to United was as real as conceding at all. Arsenal emerged as the ideological opposite, a club that rejected English football stereotypes under Arsene Wenger and introduced intelligence, nutrition, speed, and continental philosophy without losing the league's edge. The Invincibles season did not just create a legendary unbeaten run, it symbolized the peak of technical football surviving in a hostile environment. Thierry, Bergkamp, Vieira, Pires were not just stars, they were revolutionaries, proving that beauty could exist without surrendering strength. And when Arsenal faced United, the league reached a level of intensity that felt more like warfare than sport, because pride, identity, and power were always at stake. Liverpool, though inconsistent, carried the weight of history and European pedigree, making Anfield a stage for nights of impossible drama. Chelsea arrived mid-decade as the disruptors, transformed by Roman Abramovich's wealth and José Mourinho's arrogance and tactical brilliance, a club that weaponized organization, mentality, and siege warfare football to challenge the old order. Mourinho did not simply bring success, he brought narrative. He turned matches into ideological battles and press conferences into psychological weapons. Suddenly, the league was no longer about tradition alone, but about power, influence, and control. And beyond the top four, the league was deeper, more dangerous, and more competitive than any other in the world. Teams like Newcastle, Leeds, Everton, Tottenham, Bolton, Blackburn, Middlesbrough, and Aston Villa were capable of beating anyone on their day because squads were packed with internationals who would now be considered elite-level talents. Relegation battles were as dramatic as title races because survival meant everything, and failure was unforgiving. Stadiums were hostile grounds where away teams were hunted rather than welcomed. This was an era before sanitization, before corporate calm, before football became carefully packaged for universal consumption. Crowds were closer, louder, angrier, and more involved, and players felt it every second. Tackles were not symbolic gestures, they were statements of intent, and while modern football debates protection, the 2000s Premier League demanded courage above all else. Goalkeepers were allowed to be aggressive, defenders were allowed to dominate, and midfielders were warriors expected to run, bleed, and create in equal measure. Roy Keane, Patrick Vieira, Steven Gerrard, Frank Lampard, Paul Scholes, and Claude Makelele did not just play midfield, they defined what power, intelligence, and leadership meant in the center of the pitch. Every match featured individual duels that felt personal, and ongoing stories developed across seasons as players remembered past battles and carried grudges forward. Referees allowed games to breathe in a way that made matches unpredictable, chaotic, and emotionally volatile. VAR did not exist, and decisions were final, which meant injustice, drama, and controversy were woven permanently into the fabric of the league, creating moments fans still argue about decades later. The absence of instant correction gave football a mythological quality, where mistakes became legends and talking points rather than footnotes. Broadcasting technology had reached a level where matches were globally visible but not yet overproduced, meaning fans around the world felt like they were watching something authentic rather than choreographed. The commentary was emotional, the camera angles imperfect, and the narratives organic rather than forced. Football media had not yet learned to flatten personalities, so players were allowed to be villains, heroes, rebels, and outlaws without constant brand management controlling their image. Players like Wayne Rooney burst into the league as raw, unfiltered energy, while Cristiano Ronaldo arrived as a teenager shaped by abuse, criticism, and adaptation before becoming unstoppable. Their development arcs happened publicly and painfully, rather than behind protective walls. The league also benefited from a unique tactical crossroads where traditional English football had not yet disappeared and continental systems were still adapting, meaning matches featured clashes of ideology, high ball pragmatism against technical patience, high pressing against deep defending, chaos against control. Managers were characters rather than corporate spokesmen, and their touchline behavior reflected the intensity of the era. The Champions League nights bled into domestic weekends, making the Premier League feel like the center of world football rather than a feeder or secondary competition. English clubs dominated Europe not through one identity, but through variety, which made the league richer, unpredictable, and respected. This era also mattered because it was not inevitable. Success was earned, not guaranteed by financial imbalance alone, and even though money increased dramatically, the gulf had not yet become unsurmountable. Belief still mattered, atmosphere still mattered, and underdogs still had moments of genuine triumph that did not feel like statistical anomalies. The pace of the league was relentless, with winter football played in brutal conditions, testing fitness, resilience, and squad depth in ways modern rotation and sports science have softened. Players were expected to play through pain, and narratives of toughness were celebrated rather than managed away. Fans connected to players because they seemed human, flawed, exhausted, angry, and passionate, rather than distant celebrities. The league felt like a living, breathing organism, where every weekend rewrote the hierarchy slightly, and no result ever felt safe until the final whistle. Nostalgia alone does not explain why this era remains unmatched, because nostalgia fades, but the footage still feels different when watched today. The speed, aggression, unpredictability, and emotional weight of matches still translate powerfully across generations. Modern football is cleaner, smarter, and technically superior in many ways, but it rarely feels dangerous, and danger is what defined the 2000s Premier League. Danger for players' reputations, managers' jobs, and clubs' futures. It was an era where mistakes were punished brutally, and success demanded not just skill, but survival instinct. The Premier League became football's greatest era because it captured the last moment before total optimization, when chaos still had space to exist, and when football had not yet been fully tamed by data, technology, and branding. It was the era where football felt alive, uncontrollable, and honest, where the game could break your heart or elevate you to immortality in the same 90 minutes. And that combination of brutality, beauty, rivalry, personality, and unpredictability created something timeless. The 2000s Premier League did not just entertain, it defined what football could feel like at its most intense. And once an era like that passes, it does not return, because the world that allowed it no longer exists.
As the 2000s Premier League slowly faded into memory, it left behind more than trophies, records, and highlight reels. It left a feeling that modern football has spent years trying and failing to recreate. Because that decade was not just about who won or how they played, but about how the game made people feel every single weekend. The tension began long before kickoff and lingered long after the final whistle, because football then lived in the streets, pubs, living rooms, and workplaces, rather than just on screens and timelines. Rivalries were generational, passed down through families, and loyalty was tested weekly by pain, heartbreak, and triumph. The league mattered because it demanded emotional investment rather than passive consumption. And as the years passed, the game became faster, cleaner, and more controlled, but also safer and more predictable. The sharp edges were filed down in the name of progress and global appeal. The chaos that once defined matches became something to manage rather than embrace. And while today's Premier League is richer, more technical, and more globally polished, it rarely carries the same weight of consequence that once made every mistake feel fatal and every victory feel earned through suffering. The 2000s era endures in memory because it existed at the final moment when football belonged equally to players and fans, rather than algorithms and brands. When heroes were imperfect, villains were allowed, and narratives unfolded naturally without being curated in advance. It was the last era where football felt untamed, where courage mattered as much as creativity, and where legends were forged in hostile environments rather than protected by structure. And that is why, when fans look back on the 2000s Premier League, they are not just remembering matches, they are remembering an identity, a culture, and a version of football that felt dangerously alive. An era that proved the beautiful game is at its most powerful not when it is perfect, but when it is raw, unpredictable, and human. And that is why the 2000s Premier League will always stand as football's greatest era, not because it cannot be matched statistically, but because it can never be recreated emotionally.